Yeah, so hi everyone. Thank you for having me. Although in the online setting, and I hope that you still have some energy. Maybe as my context is that it's 7 a.m. and it's summer in Germany, and you wouldn't really maybe if you have never been to Germany, you would probably think, oh, it's probably not that hot, but it's horrible right now. There's like a full-on heat wave going on. So bear with me. I hope that I hope that I'm not as tired as you are and still have some fresh energy from just waking up. So thank you for having me. And I will present, but not for the whole 1 hour and 50 minutes. Maybe that's good to hear for you. And I would rather say that I present, so give you some input. And then if we have some time for questions, and I'm pretty sure we will have some time for questions. And then we also have some time to maybe talk in groups. And I would really like to hear what your thoughts and ideas are. And with that, I will jump right into it. So I want to talk to you about social bias, so bias by design, unpacking social bias in computational social science. And before I do that, before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you meet, but I can also participate online and share my knowledge. And these are the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. I hope that I didn't mispronounce it too horribly. And I also want to pay respects to their elders past and present. And today I want to kind of think about two arguments or two underlining arguments. And the first one is social bias affects computational social science as a field. So as a place where we meet and work together, and as like not only an approach. I think that's also a big discussion. Is CSS even a field? Is it a method? What is it exactly? Is it an approach? But here I see it as a field. So it's an interdisciplinary field. And then on the other hand, we also know, and we will see today, that social bias affects CSS as a method. So the methodological toolkit of CSS is also affected by social bias. And I argue that these two dimensions are very important and that we shouldn't only think about one of them, but actually bring these together. And before I begin with kind of showing you how this connects, I also, I'm not fully introducing myself, as Katharina already did that, but I also wanted to tell you why I think that I might be someone talking about this issue. So I work at GESIS, which is basically a big institute, not a university, that does a lot of infrastructure work for social sciences. So I also have one example, but if you need anything else like data or any other resources, you can definitely check out the website. The website is a bit messy. I heard that from many people that don't know the GESIS structure, but there's a lot of resources, and our main work is to support the social sciences, but not only in Germany, but globally. And that's also the department. So while this also includes survey, etc., and other methodology, I'm in the department for computational social science. But before I ended up here, I did a PhD in communication science, and my main question was, how can, and should we measure racism using computational text analysis? So specifically in communication science data. And I think this question already combines this, so the current research practices and the past research practices, and the can and should go more into a normative direction. Should we even measure racism, and under which conditions, and what are the limitations of that? And I also worked a lot on how we can move forward. So how can we actually redesign methods so that we can think about these limitations and see how we can, kind of deal with that. And other research that I do is also somehow very related to social bias. So migration, discrimination, polarization, I would say, is also very closely related to that. And again, coming more from the comm science background, I don't really know what different backgrounds are in the room right now, but I could imagine that, there are many different disciplines. And the third thing, so more on the CSS as a field and methodology, I'm really interested in making methods more accessible and also reusable. So one of my main tasks at GESIS is to work for the Methods Hub. I will also show you the Methods Hub later, but that is basically a platform where people can share their methods and other people can access the methods and actually apply it to their own data and just learn from the methods. So my whole point is to say that researching society, which which is what we do in social science, is never a neutral act, nor does it happen in a vacuum. So it is shaped by context and perspective and situated in broader structures, including public interest, also commercial interest when it's about maybe content moderation or etc., and also political interest. And this also includes resistance to research or even attacks on specific research. So we know that with words like bias, you wouldn't get good funding in the US, for example, right now. And this is clearly an attack on research and shows us that research doesn't really happen in this ivory tower. There's also a lot of academic debate. We have differing definitions and theories. We have differing epistemologies and motivations for research. And closely related to that is also epistemic justice and authority, like who gets to do research, who gets to define concepts, etc., and who can also resist to that. And very, very closely to that, it's very important that we really understand that research also has history. So there's some historical responsibility in where research itself upholds, and not only in the past, but also in the present, different discrimination forms such as racism. So one example would be scientific racism. And so given this legacy and also kind of the current context, so that there's also structural discrimination in academia and research as a field, so as a place where we go to work, it's also really important to say that and see that research in society is crucial to be approached with sensitivity and reflexivity. And meanwhile, we can also put this context-aware lens to computational social science or even specific methods such as computational text analysis. Because computational text analysis, which is a bit my focus, methodological focus, but this of course applies to any other CSS method, and CSS itself is also situated in a very dynamic context. And I think most importantly, it's super interdisciplinary, which with like close ties between computer science and computational linguistics and social scientists from different subfields. And why this is very valuable, it also can mean that on the one hand, it means that not yet really fully embedded specialized skills are demanded for different fields. So for the social science, maybe it's more the technical skills, but also for the computer scientists, it's also the skill of maybe theories and operationalization that is kind of not fully embedded in the curricula. That also means that there are different epistemological differences and also dominations. One of the more popular debates, maybe you already talked about this or you will talk about this in a later stage, is this whole debate of end of theory. So in, I think, 2008, there was this piece saying like, hey, we have computational methods now, ditch all the theory, we don't need it anymore. We just look at the data and then we find out stuff, which is an epistemology. So it's not just an opinion, but actually a way to look at data. And another way to look at data is also to think that data is neutral, because data exists. It doesn't, it's neutral. And that's also a huge debate, or like an early debate. And such debates still continue. And another debate that is also very much related to this interdisciplinarity is also the different research quality criteria, such as validity, reliability, accuracy, etc. And these can play different there are different priorities in the field, different measures, even different metrics, etc. So we see that there is not a set way of doing CSS. And while there is a sharing culture in CSS, maybe more than in other fields, we also still know that there's this academic pressure and we all have to like kind of do our career. We have this whole publish or perish aspect, etc. And all of this also happens in a very, very, very fast-paced and evolving field. So since I started my PhD, a lot has happened on the CSS front, and with, of course, AI being one of the main drivers currently. And we also have some hidden costs, such as ecological costs, but also something like data workers, etc., that are not really visible to us because that's maybe not in our financial plan, but it's still the cost that we pay to do this research. And most importantly, I think that CSS, more than some other traditional methods, is very, very dependent on the private sector. So for access, for models, for data, etc., we are very much dependent on the private sector, and that is also something that is not really acknowledged. And so acknowledging the situatedness of research and our methods also lets us acknowledge that social bias must somehow relate to research. And it asks us to rather, acknowledge the social bias, so not only the technical noise, but bias related to structural and systemic patterns of privilege, exclusion, and discrimination along many different dimensions, such as race, gender, etc. And we have to see that these different dimensions shape knowledge production in many ways, relating also to many epistemological debates within and beyond CSS, but here we want to focus on CSS. And importantly, we must understand that there are two very important reasons, among many others, of course, that urge to reflect on these social biases. First, it's a normative concern. So social bias, as we will see in a second, threatens equity. And second, we will also look at that it also threatens research quality, so for example, relating to validity and reliability. And while there's a lot of research on social bias, we saw that these two aspects of are often not really regarded as intersecting. And based on literature, so we, that means me and my co-authors from the paper, I will also tell you about this paper later, or maybe you already saw it, and we suggest to consider, to see CSS as a field, shaped by social bias, and CSS as a methodology shaped by social bias as interconnected. And we want to move, or I want to move across these two by discussing how to understand, detect, and mitigate these. And what does it mean? So understanding means, what do we know about social bias in CSS? So that's what we will talk about today. Detecting is, how can we detect social bias with CSS methodology, but also in CSS. And mitigating means, what can we do to mitigate social biases? So let's just jump right into the understanding part. So I kind of structured the presentation along these two dimensions, and we will just jump from one to the other, and we will start with CSS as a field. And understanding CSS as social bias in CSS as a field mostly and importantly relates to inequalities in participation and representation. And this not only means who gets to do the research, but also who is part of the research. So, for example, participants, and we often think about surveys when we think about participants, but we can also think about coders, for example, so annotators, as people participating in the research and also shaping the measurement instrument. And I will come back to that. And that's a really important point. And if we look at this, we can also need to see maybe data workers as part of the research, which means that, they shouldn't be treated as just cheap labor. And then we also see that there are dominant epistemologies. Some topics are more marginalized than others. Some get more funding than others. So we know this field that some topics are considered more fancy, or we know that there are some buzzwords in the field, and all these things can be related to social bias too. And lastly, so in this dimension, we also need to think about unequal access to data, computational power, and also training. So who actually, it's not even about participating in research as a field, but in participating and also getting access to these different resources. And actually, on this last point, I think it's really interesting because I think in the early years of CSS, it was really seen as a very democratizing field, right? Everyone can just run something on their computer, etc. But currently we see that it's getting more and more difficult. So we see that all these AI models are very pricey, and there's limited access to. You need an API key for different. So we know that different social media are not data is not super or not really accessible anymore, etc. And we also know that with these big models and big research questions and data sets, we of course need more computational power. And this is also a problem of resources. So this can also kind of play into this issue of social bias in fields, so who gets to participate and do research with CSS methods. Turning to CSS or social bias in CSS methodology, we can see two areas which are often focused in bias research itself. So if you look at survey bias research or error frameworks, you will see these two, so representation bias and measurement bias. And representation bias is basically the mismatch between target population and studied population, so who is included in data and models, very simply put. And measurement bias is how are these concepts operationalized, so a mismatch between theory and operationalization. And so this is just a visually put together of this representation bias, and I have two examples, but I would really like to hear also examples from you, so you can just think along, and if you have some nice examples or ideas also from your research, from your fields, please feel free to share this later. And I think one of the most prominent examples in our field is, of course, this idea of studying Twitter to study society, right? And that's really reminds me of when I did my, I think, bachelor thesis. Also using Twitter data, my advisor said something like, if you are really interested in getting to know German society, you should rather look at eBay Marketplace than Twitter. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do Twitter research, but we need to think about who actually is represented in Twitter. And that's an important aspect, so that it's representation bias when we draw a conclusion for a population that is actually not represented in the data. And another very, very current issue is, of course, the data composition in large language models. So we know that there's a lot of data used to train, but that doesn't mean that it's like all data of the world. So we know that there are some groups more represented than others, can also relate to some languages. We also know that maybe data from specific countries are more included in the model training, etc. And all these things are not just like facts, but they also really have impact on how we do research. So specifically language bias, there are so much studies looking at how language bias and these data compositions actually affect real research results. Looking at measurement bias, so the mismatch between theory and operationalization and measurement, I also brought two examples, and the first one is also from my work. So I did a literature review looking at how how our field actually uses computational methods to measure racism. And interestingly and also shockingly, I found out that many people, what many researchers do, I think it was one of the most prominent ways of doing this research, is to kind of look for keywords that relate to specific target groups, for example, migrants, and then they measure the sentiment of this text, and when it's negative, then it's racist. And I mean, when you hear it for the first time, you might think like, okay, yeah, makes sense, there's negative sentiment towards a group, but we know that sentiment classification doesn't look at, or at least in this in the way they did it, not a sentiment towards a group or towards a word in the text, but just the sentiment in the text overall. So we might, for example, miss that. So a text saying or explaining how awful the situation for brown communities in Germany is could be misclassified as racist, and also maybe racist remarks that sound positive but still are racist remarks because they put people maybe in different race groups, etc., will be missed. So because they are not detected by this negativity detection. And another example is also another study. I forgot to put the reference here, but I'm happy to send it later. It's from Saab and colleagues. Maybe you also heard about that. What they looked at different data sets, and they could find that tweets, I think it was, written in African American English dialect are, I think, two times higher or more often classified as toxic. And that's not even a model issue, but actually comes from the human annotation itself. And we can see that this is kind of a mismatch between theory and operationalization measurement, but this maybe also kind of gives you some hope, because actually this can be fixed, right? We can think about rewriting the code book, or we can think about another way to measure racism, etc. So moving on to the detection. So we know that these issues persist, and of course most of these issues have also been studied already, and we will look at this, like how to kind of detect these social biases. But not only in CSS as a field, but also with CSS. And that's also like a potential that we have with computational social science methods, that we can actually use them to look at these social biases. And here again, we start with the field. So we can use all these different methods that we have. So that's also what I already told you, what I did in my PhD, to see whether we can use these methods to scalably detect racism, sexism, and other discrimination forms. And we can use these type of tools on media data. So that's from a comp science perspective here, or on like political communication, parliamentary debates data, or like social media data. But we can also, of course, use them on academia data. So there are already studies that look at different representation of different groups within research. So on a meta science level, using computational social science models and methods. However, of course, when we use these bias methods to study bias, it can even make it more complicated. So therefore, again, it's very, very important to be very reflexive about it and really think about conceptual and ethical challenges that, still remain central. And we will talk about this a bit more in the mitigation part. More detection research is actually happening in this whole social bias in CSS as a methodology. So there's actually quite a lot of research on inspecting data sets and sampling decisions, for example. What is also done is to just see whether models perform differently for different groups. That is one way to do this research, to see whether there is some bias in our methods itself. And then, of course, the other way to do it, or another option, is to test multiple perspectives. And so, for example, human coders, etc., and how this then relates to validity and credibility. And this is actually something that we also did, also within my dissertation. And what we wanted to look at, or take a closer look at, is human coder bias. So when we do human annotation or coding or whatever it is called in your field, I think that's the other thing. We have very different terminology for this. So when we do human coding, we do that specifically in CSS to validate our classifiers and to see if they work and if they align with human coding decisions. And here, disagreement between coders is often or almost always seen as noise. So it's an error that we need to kind of reduce. But actually, this variance between human coding can also be a signal, specifically if this disagreement is based on coder level or text level characteristics. So for example, coder level characteristics such as specific attitudes, specific perspectives, etc. So do people have to agree? Maybe we can see a value in how they disagree when it's systematic. And the other part of that is the text level characteristics. So we know that text, specifically discriminating text or like racist text, can be very ambiguous. People don't want to tell you, or some do, but most people don't want to show you that they are racist. So they will use evasive and ambiguous language, and we need to find a way to detect that too. So there are text level characteristics that can actually lead to disagreement that is valid and systematic. And we did this, or we did a study where we wanted to see whether the binary classification of racism in German news media text actually is impacted by specific attitudes. I will not go too deeply into that, but I'm also happy to share the study. And we could actually find systematic impact of people that are negatively affected by racism, and also people that have a very high awareness for the topic of racism, or like not high awareness, but specific context. So they regularly talk about this topic. They know people that are affected, etc. And we also could see that education also impacts the coding decision. And this is a really, really important point, because if we kind of say that, I don't know how deep you're already in this Krippendorf's alpha, for example, or on other reliability measures, but what they basically say is that intersubjectivity matters, and if you have like a reliability score 1, then everything's perfect. I think that's unachievable, but you try to kind of get the score very high. That means you want everyone to agree. But what we say is that if intersubjectivity matters, it matters also who these subjects are. So if I would, like going back here, if I would have 5 people that are actually basically very similar on all these different categories that have an impact here, they might agree, and this might lead to a very high reliability score. But the question is whether this is still valid, because including other perspectives might have led to disagreement, but actually meaningful disagreement. And this is something that we are still figuring out. So kind of differentiating between when is disagreement valid and when is it not valid. So an issue when it's a reason why when it's not valid is, for example, just errors or attention slips, etc. But differentiating between these two things, or like two reasons for disagreement, I think is a very, very current or maybe upcoming field even. So if you're interested in that, please do research on that, because this is something that we really need, specifically when we see human coding data as gold standard. And for it to be gold, it definitely needs to be polished a bit more right now. And we don't really, we should be spending more time on that. And another, I think, kind of worrying, to me, very worrying thing that is happening right now is persona prompting. So I also don't know if you've heard about this, but basically the idea is that we can simulate humans with AI, so generative AI, with specific with a specific prompting technique, which is called persona prompting. So we would kind of ask to LLM to simulate a specific persona. So for example, I have an example in a second, and the setting where we don't do this is just called default prompting. So if I ask, like, act as if you're an affected person and affected by racism, and say whether this text is racist or not, this would be persona prompting. But just to ask the LLM to classify a text as racist or not would be the default prompting. And this is, again, kind of worrying, because there's a lot of research right now on how to use this for surveys. So how can we actually replace or partially replace human participation in research, specifically in survey research, but of course also in coding for content analysis. And then this is usually evaluated by comparing this to existing data, so existing survey data or existing coding results with human participants. And you might think, like, okay, it should work, right? So there should be some effect that maybe works. And some studies also show that it works. But we also know that we know that data, we already talked about this data composition issue that we have with AI models. So let's see whether it can work. And I think the literature here is very split. I think it's also like a very normative question, like, do we even want to do that? I think that's maybe also something we can discuss about later. So just as an example, so if you instruct the model as to respond as a German 30-year-old woman with migration background, it's really important to understand that it's actually not this person that is responding, but actually the sum of all the assumptions that is contained in the training corpus. And if we look at this prompt again, so it's like woman and migration background, we know that these specific groups are also affected by anti-immigration, sexist hate speech, etc. So the data, for example, if we look at social media data, and if we look at how these groups are mentioned in this data, this kind of asks this question whether it's really about the self-perception and expression. So me as a person with migration background, I would, or is it something that, is it an external attribution and description? So when does these two different things kind of, like, how do they actually affect or impact these persona settings? And I think this, I haven't seen any like research trying to reverse engineer this. It could be super interesting. So if that's maybe a project idea also for you, it would be super interesting to see whether we can actually find this in the data. But what we did, instead, we wanted to see whether this default versus persona assigned makes it different. And I think that's the other thing. So we can think that persona assignment, this sounds kind of like sketchy, we shouldn't do that. But what is actually the default prompting? So is the default prompting really default, and what is this default, and who is represented in the default, right? And what we did was that we had 4 conditions. So being affected by racism, having contact with racism, age, and education. So these were from the human data. And what we did was to prompt the LLMs with specific combinations of these 4 categories, and asked the model to classify racism in news media. So that was a 0-shot classification. I think we had one example, so 1-shot classification, and then we compared it to the default. So this is basically, so all these coefficients are always in comparison to the default when we didn't assign any persona. And what we could see is that specifically all models that we prompted as being negatively affected by racism, taking in this marginalized perspective, were significantly different to the default model. So, and this kind of this is just the other big question. So is the default prompting itself actually a persona, but just an unacknowledged one? So does it really make sense to completely ditch this idea of personas, because we think like, okay, if we just use the default, it should be fine, right? But we don't really know. And how do we deal with that? Like, should we use personas or not? I think this is something, like, this is an ongoing discussion in the field. So I'm just like, I also don't have a solution for every of these questions. I'm just raising some questions that you can just think along when you do the next LLM text classification, maybe in your project, and you want to look at something where you think, okay, this is like a rather subjective text analysis task, then it might be interesting to see how these personas might impact the codings. So, yeah. And this actually leads to, I mean, this is already an example for these prompt experiments. And I think this is definitely in detecting social bias and specifically LLMs, a great way to do so. So we can actually use varying inputs, so prompts, to see how they impact the output. So we just compare the output. And this is something that you can try yourself, right? So for another workshop, I just prompted, like, this is not a systematic study. It was just like me trying to find a nice beginning slide for a presentation. And I just asked a visual model to generate a picture of a scientist holding a workshop on AI and discrimination. I was not really surprised, but of course we see some lab codes, which is interesting because you wouldn't, maybe AI and discrimination, not really think about someone in a lab code, but this is just the embedded association of a scientist. And we also can see that it's not really diverse here. And what I tried then is to, I just wanted to see what actually in Germany would change. So I just added this in Germany to this prompt. And of course, Germans love to have the German flag everywhere. And I don't know, I would say it got even less diverse. And then and if you know German language, in German language, the gender is very much part of the language. So with every something a scientist, there's the male form of the word and the female form of the word. So and usually, like here, I tried it with the generic male form, and then I like specifically tried it with the female form, and then it was a bit different. But so no German flags, but beer. I don't know if you can see it, but everyone has a glass of beer on their desk, which I would also say is like a cultural kind of, I don't know what you think, but I would say this like Germany association with beer is something that was kind of pushed into this, right? I also wanted to see what difference it makes to not have Germany there, but in the US. And we also know that the US is a bit more patriotic even. So they also have even more flags. And I would say someone who looks like a young Trump on the screen, but not sure. And it's of course in Washington, DC. And you can, of course, see the White House in the background. And this is just an example. So this is something that you can try yourself. I didn't try it with Australia. It would be very interesting to see if, I don't know, you would have kangaroos in the background or whatever the LLM or like the visual model here actually does. But this is, yeah, just a way of kind of looking at this. And I think this, even if you do it for fun, in a not too resourceful way, it kind of shows how easily it is to see how biased it is. So it's not just like something hidden or something that is like really need to be found, but like it's just like some simple prompt, and then you just add a country and it changes so much. And I think this is really important for us as researchers to really understand that when we use specifically AI for this knowledge production, we kind of risk, and I know it's kind of a provocative word, but we kind of risk laundering social bias as knowledge. And this is just kind of important to see when we use these models. And I'm really not saying that we shouldn't use them. I also use them sometimes, but it's really important to do that in a very reflective, critical, and careful way. Moving on, let's talk about, so we know already like there is social bias in the field and in the methodology, and we also maybe know now how we can detect this or how we can study this. And you might ask, like, what do we do now, knowing that we have these issues? Should we just like stop doing our PhD or start another job or start another topic? And here again, we have kind of split this for methodology and field. And for the methodology, we kind of can look at different stages of bias mitigation. So ex ante, so before and during data collection, and a posteriori, so after data collection. So it really depends on specific projects and what stage you are in your projects. And I think this is specifically something that I would also like to talk to you about, also regarding maybe the projects that are upcoming, but also projects that you're already working on. And looking at kind of research projects where you are still in the design process. Of course, like careful research design is very important. And like specifically like a really easy tip to just, for me, like I really like to draw out the research design, so kind of in a pipeline way. And when you do that for yourself, you can really like go from the beginning to the end and really think about where social bias might affect your model, right? Like, or your way of doing research and your research design, and to really like do that for yourself, and then also to document that. So really to kind of to be very transparent about this is very, very important, and also to specifically document every step. So if you do human annotation, why not actually make some notes about who these annotators were, when we know that there is, so most, like I think all studies that look at human coder bias actually found that there is human coder bias. So maybe that's a good reason to really document who is doing research and also kind of infer on these different statistics or information. Another really important aspect is to really do mixed methods, so kind of combining CSS with survey data, with qualitative methods. And I actually would take back this qualitative methods, because I think that CSS is both quantitative and qualitative. I think what I probably meant more is manual methods, and to really see how actually research combining different methods brings a lot of value specifically for these aspects where kind of hidden biases can maybe be detected before you really do the data collection. And then, of course, use fair and care principles, so reflexive data practices. And probably you maybe heard about this already in the other talk, but there is the FAIR principle. I would say that is like very, very established in the field, and everyone knows what FAIR is, and everyone would say like, yeah, definitely that's something that we should adhere to. So data should be findable, data should be accessible, data should be interoperable, and data should be reusable. So this kind of really relates to these different quality criteria that we have, such as reproducibility. And looking at care, this means C for collective benefit. So data should benefit the communities the data also comes from, and not only the researchers or institutions. We have the A for authority of control. So the communities also have the right to govern how their data is used. And that's really important when we talk about who is represented in LLMs. Maybe some groups don't want to be represented by some AI model, right? So I think we should also not just try to find different ways to make everyone represented in the data if we don't really know if they even want to be represented in the data, specifically in this persona setting, for example. Then R is for responsibility. So data users are responsible. So we are responsible for preventing harm. So kind of stopping misuse, misrepresentation, and stigmatization. Maybe this can also be a bit contradictory to the reusable and accessible. So I, for example, have a study where I collected racist terms, so racist language. I will also show you this in a second. And I didn't publish that. And I know that's something that I also get criticized a lot for, but it did feel weird to me just to put up some list of racist language on my GitHub or something like that. And I think this kind of relates more to this care aspects. And then the E is for ethics. So data practices must respect rights, values, and norms. So also kind of cultural sensitivity, justice, and accountability, and should be very, like this care principle is more community and participants focused. And I think kind of, to think about both of these and to specifically also push the care agenda more in the CSS field could really benefit the field and also relate to the social bias aspect. And one also specific or more specific example that is something that I really want to work on more or work with more is participatory CSS. So we know there's participatory research designs, etc. And but using this participatory approach for computational social science is, I would say, rather something that is beginning to happen, but actually it already has been happening for a long time. And one example is captcha labeling. So whenever you are asked to classify, a traffic light or a bus stop or something like that, a study found out that this data that you're doing, like this data that you're producing by these micro decisions, were then used to actually train models. So you were like, or we were all kind of participating in, improving these models. And we know that, of course, that other data is also used for training, and the same goes for data annotation and workers. So they actually are also kind of changing or impacting the measurement instruments, so the classifiers, and not only the data. That's a big difference between just like survey participants and participatory CSS. So it's not just about giving data, but actually impacting and shaping the measurement instrument. And in both these examples, the measurement instrument is the classifier. And in these settings, however, it's very unacknowledged, unvalued, without consent. Like I didn't know that my captcha decisions might be used for something, and it's also often very unethical. So the tasks are, really explicit, or the payment is low, etc. So actually, while there is this participatory thing somehow also happening, it's not really participatory. It's because there is no real say in design or values, and it's not connected to all these things that are important for participatory design. And there's a really nice concept and also paper von Sloan and colleagues saying that this is participation washing. So it kind of has the idea of participatory CSS, but it's actually, just like washing these models, and this is happening a lot in also AI design right now. But how can we actually do this more inclusive and also in a better and meaningful way is, of course, to see that this is actually a moment where we can correct power imbalances beyond mere inclusion. So it's not just about having some people code, but actually giving them the power to really define something, and also to convince us when we disagree, to really think that, to see each other or to meet each other on the same eye level. And this has to happen, of course, by adhering to ethics, and as I already said, the kind of also sharing this epistemic authority. And we also need to really shift from this idea of language as data to language as people. So that's, I think that's something that happens a lot in CSS, because we always think about these vast amount of data, and we just say like, oh, nice data, we can do cool stuff. But of course, behind these data, there are people, and that's the way of kind of shifting the narrative here. This comes, of course, also with challenges. So how can we kind of find a conversation that doesn't really pressure? So it's like with payment, like, do we actually ask them to do something that they don't want to, but the payment is so good that they might just do it? So all these things to think about pressure, etc., ethical considerations, and of course, most importantly, to find a language, or like to kind of translate between different languages. I already said already within the disciplines, some talk about coding, some about annotation, etc. But how do we kind of adapt this when we really want to do participatory research? And one example, for example, is the feminist data annotation workshop. This is also a project where they really try to do annotation not as like, here is a link to our I don't know, potato setup and code this now, but they actually did workshops to do this annotation work together, and making the labor visible. So the labor behind the annotation process, also kind of centering care. So to have discussions between the participants, etc. They could much better integrate the context of these different people that were included in this project. And kind of relating to this disagreement aspect, they could really embrace this disagreement, because with these conversations, with these collaborative setting, they could really understand why people disagreed on specific texts. And because they did so, they knew that they don't have to collapse the disagreement into one majority decision, but they could actually use the disagreement as a signal and use it to kind of make their research more valid. Another example from my own research is a participatory approach to dictionary creation. So I already told you about this racist dictionary idea, and what I kind of propose as a method also within my PhD is to see that dictionaries can be, or like dictionaries also in terms of like search string lists, etc., or it can also be used as features in supervised classification or seeds in topic modeling. So not only the classic dictionary analysis where most people would say like, oh, isn't this a bit outdated? But we know in practice we use lists of words for basically every CSS research, there is some list of words needed at some point, and this is what this relates to. And this can be easily turned into a participatory aspect, so it could be an easy entry point. And here the idea is that the term collection, so is the moment where we can actually integrate participation. So we can think about including surveys or interviews, etc. We can think about with whom we want to do that and how. Is it like in a conversation? Is it in an online form, etc.? And so in that way, we kind of collect terms. So the core list of terms, and then we can think about whether we want to actually refine this list. And this is exactly where this epistemic authority issue comes in, right? So if we would just go through the list from top down and just like delete everything that was suggested, this would rather be not really participatory CSS, because we want to be convinced. We want to give away, or like give partially this this epistemic authority to the participants, so we can really think about, do we even want to refine the list, and with whom do we want to do that, and how? And the same goes for validation. Do we want other people to validate the list then, or like to create the validation data set? Do we do that with the same people? And in what setting do we do that? And this can then lead to a dictionary or a part of the dictionary. So as I said, I did that for racist language. So I had 2 surveys asking people to submit terms that they found that they kind of saw as racist language. And with that, I had like a really long list of terms. And when I looked at that, I then decided to actually refine it, but with my very kind of broad definition of what is racist language. I did that because there were terms such as COVID deniers, which like just from a validity point would not fall into racist language, right? So that's kind of a way to do something like that. Moving on to the a posteriori strategies, so basically strategies that we propose once data collection is conducted. Very, very typical is statistical error correction. So working with different weightings, etc., to see whether you can kind of correct bias that you know of. And another thing, regardless of anything, actually, is the very transparent reporting of limitations. So actually, we do kind of look at limitations, and there can be a section really assessing the social bias that might have affected this research, right? So this is something that we could do, this similar to like positionality statements in qualitative research, for example. That's something that we can also embrace in CSS research, and this also goes for data statements and model cards. So model cards, for example, is a standardized document providing like key information about the models that were used, so kind of like a nutrition label that also kind of promotes transparency and fairness. And we can also think about this for different other stages in the research. I also wanted to like very quickly talk about debiasing, and debiasing, I think, lies somehow like across these ex ante and a posteriori, because you can also use this use these efforts. So debiasing, basically technical intervention to reduce bias and social bias in models, can be used also at different stages. So you can fix data before training. A very prominent strategy to do that, for example, is swap demographic terms in training data. So for example, swap pronouns, or also, for example, we did that for a classifier looking at negativity in political coverage. We swapped the parties so that there is no association already between a party and a specific sentiment in the classifier. We just swapped around with the parties in the data. We can also adapt the model during training with the human in the loop, for example, as a strategy. And we can also intercept social bias in the output, so kind of adapting the outputs. And this, of course, again, comes with challenges, as all the things that we do. So what is even social bias? When it is debiased enough? Can we actually really debias something? And who decides on a debiased model, etc.? And this can also go terribly wrong. And I think the most prominent example is, I think I forgot the name of the model. I think it was Gemini, but maybe you saw this example. So they debiased so much that if you prompt for a 1943 German soldier, you get some diversity in who were these soldiers, but that's actually just historically wrong and also harming these groups, right? And this is like a great example for debiasing gone wrong. I saw a really interesting talk on food representation in AI models, and then, I think it was parties, and that was also interesting because you could see if you prompted, they showed that they prompted something like a birthday party in the US, a birthday party in India, a birthday party, etc. And all these birthday parties were very diverse, and who was represented at the table or in the room, but it was always the same composition of people in demographic groups, and that's just wrong because the demographic proportions and visibility of groups is different from country to country, right? So you would see the same demographic diversity in the US as for India, which was, it's funny to look at, but again, a good example where you can see that there was probably some top level decision to have a system prompt that said when you prompt for groups of people, these 5 demographic groups should always be present, and then you see how this actually then leads to wrong and invalid outputs. Yes. Moving on to one of my last slides is kind of what do we do when we think about CSS as a field to mitigate social bias. And here, most importantly, we need to move beyond diversity to structured information. So it shouldn't be just adding more people to an existing system without changing any standards or what counts as rigor or which methods are rewarded or topics are rewarded. But we really need to kind of see this as a structural aspect and need to really transform also the structures and not only who is part of the existing structures. This means that we need to find ways to support marginalized scholars and also institutions, specifically also thinking about this access issue, right? Like the data access, the method access, etc. So we need more open, accessible training and resources, and we definitely need more collaboration. So I think once you go to a conference, you see that even though a conference is global or international, you see that there are groups and that they don't really mingle, and we can actually design ways to change that. And specifically regarding the training and the resources, we can talk about the ideas later. I wanted to just quickly introduce the Methods Hub. So this is the link to the Methods Hub, and it's kind of growing. So I think we went online last year in October or something like that. And the idea is to kind of have a repository of different methods and models where people can openly access the method. So there is, for example, something on how to use I think, bird classifier to detect languages. And if you want to do that, for example, for one of your projects, you could just go on the website and just look at the code and see if it fits. There's also the way it has this try it out button. And if you click on that, you can actually really try it out on a web-based RStudio or Jupyter Notebook. So you don't have to have any computational setting, which is also great for teaching. You can just open it and really play around with it. You can upload your own data and see if you can apply it already, etc., without having any setup needed on your local computer. But it definitely needs more than that. So this was just one example. And another example is, of course, the summer school. So all the Summer Institute of Computational Social Science schools across, it's also a global network, and also other accessible training. So this is really a moment where we can actually value these efforts in the field to make things more accessible. And to sum up, social bias shapes knowledge production. So who does research on what, with which resources? So this is the bias in the field, but we also know that social bias shapes data, methods, models, and measures. And we hopefully, now too, that addressing this kind of improves the equity, but also the research quality. So it also improves the validity, reliability, etc., and other values that we have and that we should also push as a research community. And this brings me to the most important point, because I think social bias is often treated as this niche topic, as there's some people doing stuff on that. But I really think specifically with this whole let's use AI for everything moment, that social bias is central and not peripheral to CSS, and that we really need to be aware of it and give the attention to it that it actually needs. And in this intersection between social bias and computational social science, if I can just give you 3 tips or 3 things that we should just keep with us or keep thinking about is, first of all, critical reflection. So this idea that I already mentioned, to kind of really think about your research project and see, okay, what are the steps where it could be affected by social bias or other issues, is one way of doing that. Of course, also to think about methods, not as like, oh, this is like, there's not one way to do research. So I can detect racism in very, very different ways. And this goes to every project. So and that's also the nice part of research, the design part of research, because you get to make all these different decisions. And one decision could be to actually integrate more than one method. So really think about methodological pluralism, and to really, to kind of use the summer school also to really work on this toolkit. So it shouldn't be one tool, but like the way you combine different tools. And the other is to also really innovate the methods that we use. So if you look at the classifier and you know that there's some issue, why not completely come up with a completely different idea of conducting a classifier? And this idea could be the participatory method. So for example, I started this racist dictionary paper, and I thought like, okay, it just feels weird to sit there and just decide on racist language myself, right? This was my spark that actually brought me to this idea to use participatory methods. And I think this is exactly what we can also embrace, which is also really the fun part of research, I think, to really think about how we can innovate these fields. And here we can see this social bias as a problem and see how we can use pluralism, innovation to change that. And before we get there, we need this critical reflection, because that's where we kind of see all these different, where we can flag all these issues. And I think with that, I think really I know that I talked about a lot of limitations in research, and maybe you might think like, okay, maybe we should just not do it, or etc. But this is really not meant as like discouraging you from conducting research. Instead, it should motivate you to kind of understand not only what you want to look at, but also how you want to look at, what tools you want to use, because there's so much degree of freedom in there. And we can really use the moment to meet this with innovation, and to also continue to study society with CSS, understanding that this whole kind of happens within this very, very, very complex field. Thank you. This was maybe my still very long input part. I hope you're still awake and might want to share about your projects. I mean, I already heard that you don't have like projects for these weeks, but it would if we have some time for questions in general. But if I can also ask questions to you, I would be really interested in what you think, how the social bias relates to your projects, maybe your PhD projects or other projects that you work on, also projects that you might want to work on in the next weeks, and also whether you already have some solutions in your mind, and what do you think, how feasible it is, etc. That would be if I could ask questions, and I would just share that these papers. But I think that Katharina already or it was already in the schedule, but I can share this later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you first, Ahrabhi, for a wonderful intervention and so comprehensive. And I think it was perfect balance between, being very inspiring, but also prompting us to reflect. In the interest of time, I think we'll do a 10-minute Q&A. And if it's okay, we'll give the participants a choice of whether they want to talk about their projects or ask you a question. I hope that's all right. Yeah. So anyone who's willing to either ask a question or share, respond to Ahrabhi's prompts. Yes.
Hi, my name is Utami. I want to ask specifically related to language, since you mentioned about language in your presentations. So my question is related, if you do a cross-country research, like cross-language research, and so what is your suggestion to approach that research project related to minimize the social bias in that research? Especially when we have two different languages, is it better to translate all those different languages into English and then translate it, analyze it using LLM, or just like using, an individual language, so we don't translate it into English, and then after that, just sharing the analytic code book, and then, in a shared analytical code book at the end. This is related to how to reduce the social bias related to that kind of research.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think language bias is one of the biggest issues, definitely, specifically in conducting research. I think it really depends on what languages you are using. Maybe you can share that, like, or do you mean in general, or do you have specific languages in mind? But I think it's a good question because one of my PhD supervisors knows a lot about that. So maybe you can look her up. Her name is Fabienne Lind. I can also share her name later. But I think there are different strategies, and exactly what you said are these different strategies. But with LLMs, I think, yeah, I wouldn't really know one specific of way doing that. But if you can actually do both and systematically compare that, right? And I think that's quite interesting. So I think we could see, like, specifically in hate speech research, that some terms, when you translate them, okay, one term from like Dutch hate speech is the word pancake, is kind of considered as offensive, like calling someone a pancake. And if you would just translate that, I think this cultural context goes missing. Like that, this is something that studies could also show. And I think that's, if you're interested in that, it could be interesting to, in your pipeline, to actually compare this before deciding on one way to go. But yeah, I understand that this is really dependent on the resources that we have, right? Like, I know that time is also an issue often. I think, yeah, but from what I know from LLMs, I think that, like, kind of also prompting in the same language versus prompting in English, etc., also makes differences. So basically every prompt decision makes differences. But you could, yeah, I think you should systematically look at this, and that depends on how much your languages are already represented in the training data or not. This is also something that you can look up from most models. You can look up how the language compositions are for models.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
Yeah, I've worked with some multilingual data as well. And I found, so I think it also depends on the model. So different models would have different biases and in the languages. But I found that if you use a single prompt, for example, in English, and then you query, for example, you want to extract data from multiple texts in different languages, I think they perform rather similarly in this way, because for some model, there's not really much difference because they don't really think in a language, but rather they represent that. I'm not completely familiar with the mechanics of this, but from what I've tested, statistically speaking, there's not much variation. So for English, Russian, and Chinese, there would be not much variation if you're using, let's say, the latest generation of Gemini models. Or if you're using Claude, if you're using Haiku wouldn't have much difference. Or you're using GPT-OS, also, at least in my case, it wasn't that important, but I guess it would matter in your particular research area or your particular research question. So I think it's just the most important thing is to test and then come up with a way of measuring bias that would be rigorous enough for you to suggest that, for example, the difference in languages did not impact your results. Thanks.
Any other questions, or anyone willing to share the project, how social bias relates to it? Any solutions that come to your mind? Any provocations? I know it's been a long day.
Just kind of touching on the persona stuff because you were talking about it. I do some work on using personas and census-informed seed data to help recommender systems kind of overcome this dominant culture bias. And something that we always talk about is like, yes, obviously we're dealing with, majority representations of minority groups and things like that. But in the end, it's ultimately, I know, a slightly better approach than not thinking about it at all, which is what a lot of these recommender systems do already. So kind of letting perfect be the enemy of good and things like that, where you're like, we can kind of approach these things a little bit and kind of make marginal improvements without, really completely fixing the problem of bias within these systems, which we know is still going to be there.
Absolutely. I really think it depends on what you use it for, right? And I think you touched on this, on that thing that really annoys me with this default prompting. It's not better. It's already, there is some persona kind of baked into that. And that's also what we could show in this empirical setting. And it's not really acknowledged as one. It's just like thought of as like the neutral model or default model or etc. But I really think it depends on what we use it for. And I think your project sounds to me as something that has less impact on, like, I think in survey research, I don't know, I think it's kind of interesting to see what I understand that the issue is that there are less and less people willing to participate in surveys. But I also think in a time where trust in science is declining, we should be very careful in how we also communicate to survey participants that we might replace them with AI models. But I think in your case, it has a different impact, right? But the idea is not really replacing participation in a survey or etc., where we actually know that LLMs are just predicting something, while human attitudes, or like there is 100 years of behavioral research. I think for your case, I think it sounds to me more reasonable to also see how it also impacts. Like, it would be very interesting whether you could actually, so if I can ask two questions to you too, like what type of persona categories did you use? So just like the census data, and could you then also see systematic differences in the recommendation, right? So I guess that you could find that this really impacts the system.
Oh, yeah. So the seeding's done heuristically. So we make a focus group of 100,000 statistically probable Australians, and then give them to a LLM to say, you are this person with, age, demographic information, big 5 personality traits, all that jazz. So it's quite fleshed out. And then you create these focus groups and ask, did this, well, it was for news articles. So does this news article matter to you? Would you read it? Do you care about it? And it seems to create a completely different response to your normal kind of click-based, recommender system, which is what you normally get, where it's just like, would someone click on this article, yes or no? And kind of having that intermediate step. But statistically, it's hard to test because we haven't been able to deploy it, essentially.
Okay. But interesting.
Teams is about to kick us out, so
yes.
1 or 2 more questions or reflections.
Okay, I got a question. This is not my area, but a little bit of a provocation. But the persona thing, it sounds awfully like you're creating stereotypes based on quantitative data. Can't you just use real people?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly this thing, right? Like, that's also my point. And we have these discussions here a lot because we are an institute for resources and social science. So there is kind of like a big focus on using AI for exactly that. But then, on the other hand, like, it relates to this, like, what do we do with the default, right? Like, I think these are two questions that coexist, but I think there's a difference in doing that for content analysis, like having default prompting for content analysis, and then the survey research is a whole different field. And I absolutely agree with this provocation, and I think this is the discussion that we're still having. So I think there is no real, there is no fixed solution yet. And one argument that most people use is that they don't really use this to simulate survey participants like in the phase of the surveys, but actually for pre-testing, for example, to see whether the questions are understandable, etc. Where I would also say this actually should be the one moment where we need human, because it's about human reading of text and understand, like, comprehensibility of text. I cannot really respond because I agree. I think this is a great question that we need to discuss more. So I think there's also this argument of, like, people are already doing that. We should also, like, it shows that there's, like, complex interests in these questions. But that's what we do. So we because we only look at text data, of course, also survey data is used to train. And this is one argument. So we might just use stereotypes to maybe look at stereotypes, etc. And the other argument is, of course, that it's very circular, right? Like, specifically in a survey setting, we do this type of methods to find out whether there are new developments, new dynamics in society. But if we just use a model that is trained on old data, we actually have a circular research practice because we just do predictions on what we already know. And it also kind of limits the way we can actually discover new phenomena. It could be interesting when the new pandemic hits us or whatever is happening. So that's the other big criticism on this type of research.